Okay, Belinda, we're talking about some serious subjects here. We're always talking about very serious subjects here.
Yes, I mean, it'd be nice to be able to lighten up, but I don't think we can't yet, no.
We're in a lot of trouble.
That's right, and the subjects are very painful, very distressing, very shocking, and most people want to blank them out, so...
but you're a fighter.
Well, I like to think of myself as a fighter or a warrior, yes. In fact, I've called my campaign this year a battle, and it's called the Battle for Britain's Children. And 2014 seems to have a resonance with the beginning of World War I, 1914, and also with 1940, the Battle for Britain, the historical Battle for Britain. So for those two reasons, 2014, Battle for Britain 2014 seem to fit quite well.
But surely, Belinda, really this is just some kind of fantasy of yours, because the government's got a lot of very caring agencies which are caring for our children and bringing the warmth of help to troubled families across Britain, and helping these troubled people empathically with a great deal of caring action through the loving care of the court system and the system. So obviously there's nothing actually wrong, and you're just really a deluded person who really is just wasting her time.
Well, Miles, I'm not quite sure where you've been in the last few years, but if I were a deluded person, I think probably I, number one, would be aware that I was being deluded, because other people than you would have told me, and therefore I would at least have put that possibility past the consideration of my innermost mind, if you like. But it's a question of how many other people seem to be deluded alongside with me, and not only just seem to be deluded, using your word, which I don't subscribe to, but I'm just using it for the moment, but also can show solid evidence of the situation being quite other in some cases, in quite too many unacceptable number of cases, quite different to what you suggested.
Now, I was being really pointedly, deliberately sarcastic there, but really this is a very, very serious point, is that the vast majority of people really don't realise there's a problem.
They don't realise there's a problem because it hasn't happened to them personally, and this is really when people start to really have to face the problem, as you put it, the problem being the problem. It's when it happens to them or a close member of their family or someone within their circle of friends or a neighbour, or it comes within their immediate orbit of consciousness. And that's when they're forced to look at it, and this is a very painful and traumatic moment for quite a lot of people. So that number of people who are forced to face this issue in our society is growing. Why is it growing? Because the numbers of families having their children taken away, and the numbers of children seemingly unjustly being placed in care when there's no real crashing necessity to take them into state care. The families from which they're taken very often are completely normal, loving families, and there may have been some blip or some little incident in the family life, or it may be that some malicious rumour has been put about by one party in the family against another party in the family, or it may be simply that the mother, the father, the little family unit, and quite often the single family unit, is exceptionally vulnerable, and exceptionally, for that reason, targetable, because they are quite isolated. So isolation seems to be a big factor in these abduction scenarios, which is what we regard them as. When children are taken away for no good reason, abducted, it would seem, by the authorities. And why, in many cases? Because they can, because they have the power, they have the courts behind them, they have the family so-called justice system, which you referred to, which should be a wonderful thing, shouldn't it?
What's basically wrong here? What happens to them when they're in care? Is there anything terrible happening to them?
Right, the process of getting into care is wrong for a start, because the quality of justice administered by the family court is too low to match the gravity of what is being done to the family and the vulnerable children in the family. So the family justice system operates quite a low standard of the examination of evidence.
This is a horrendous thing happening to the children. I mean,
yes, I've actually been in the High Court in front of an appeal judge who said that the family justice courts should apply the same standards as criminal courts because of the gravity, the seriousness of what is being done to a child when you take it from its parents. He didn't actually go so far as to spell out that that was the reason, but he just said, rather laughingly almost, that he was for a higher standard and a criminal standard being applied in the family court. And that was one judge. On the other hand, there must be quite a few who believe that, and yet still we have this situation where social workers, members of the local authority social work team, can bring evidence against parents, and they have to be the evidence has to be against parents because something then very draconian is going to be done to the parents. They're going to have their children removed. So it's against the parents to present to the court that those parents are unable to look after their children, and the state therefore should intervene and protect the children. It's all done for the best interests of the children, the protection of the children. And yet the actual examination of the evidence is derisory. There's no examination of the evidence. If it's in the social worker's file, the lady or gentleman who's been in charge of the family and in charge of the case that's being brought before the court, the judge will say, and I've heard judges say this from their bench, that public officials don't lie because the parents, from their dock or wherever they are trying to give their side of the story, will shout out sometimes in the court. And I've been in these hearings, the parents shout and get very agitated and very, very angry sometimes. And the judge will then shout them down and say, you have to behave yourself, or something, something like that. And public officials don't lie because they are professional people who have long experience and professional qualifications to bring these facts before the court, and they have to do it, and that's it. End of.
Have things changed in the last 10 or so years to make this a worse situation, or?
What makes it, and this is where I was going back to when you asked me about how many people are aware of this, and I say more and more people are becoming aware, and the reason is that there are more and more cases of children being taken into care. And you might say, well, and quite a few people, using the devil's advocate type of approach that you employed at the beginning of this interview, they might say, well, that's a very good thing because we know that a lot of families are not looking after their children. There's a lot of dysfunction in families, and obviously there are families that are just too damn poor to be able to look after their children properly and feed them properly. We know that. So the numbers of cases are growing, and then also there are these horrific cases where children are left, however they came to be left, and not picked up by the local authority officials supposed to be charged with child protection, that suffered the most terrible abuse in the so-called sanctity of the home, and that was not picked up by whole bands of officials. Supposed to be
terrible killings and tortures.
Yes, that's right. There's a string of names.
Cigarette burns and all.
Yes. We don't even need to go through the names. Victoria Clanby in this borough that we're in now, and Baby P is also from this borough. So this borough already has a notorious weighting against good child protection services, and yet this borough, you might think that having gone through the public humiliation of having such notorious high-profile cases of damaged children would be bending over backwards to intervene where it should intervene. And then sometimes I've heard recently that there are a few families in Haringey where, the mother is a drug addict. She's got 10 children. The children are all kept in an appalling state. Something should be done to help that family, and they're not doing anything. That's the sort of thing.
So what are could you try and... I think one is tapping one's toe.
One is tapping one's toe.
If you want to tap your toe, it's fine, but maybe you took your shoe off, you could still tap.
All right, yes.
Then it would be happy to tap, and it would make a noise.
Happy tapping.
As opposed to telling you to stop tapping.
Right, okay.
Right, okay.
Right.
What essentially is the problem in that? What's wrong with these? Why is it a bad thing that these children are being taken into so-called care.
Right. The bad thing is when they don't need to be, and therefore the children are traumatised because they don't want to be taken from their parents. The whole thing, if you look at it from the child's point of view, it's the worst thing that can happen to a child, especially a very small young child, to be taken from the only people sometimes that it's known throughout its small, young, short life. To be put with strangers. I remember exactly that scenario as a child myself, because I was sent too early for my comfort to a boarding school.
Yes.
And it was very painful. And there were incidents before then when I was taken from my mother and put with somebody else to look after me, as happened in that type of rural family of a certain class. So
now, from a child psychology point of view, that the child itself feels it's done something wrong.
Well, it wouldn't say right or wrong. It would say that made it very unhappy, or say that it doesn't like, or that it's frightened of. It's frightened. You know, the first thing is that confidence in the situation in which it had thought it was in is shattered. You know, the parent, the adult to whom it was very attached, that is somehow, the bond is broken suddenly, and it's put with strangers, and it may protest and it may shriek and cry and all the rest of it, and nobody's listening and nobody's caring, apparently.
But the term is care. They've been taken into care. Is there an absence of care?
It sounds like care, and possibly superficially it would be cared for in care. It would possibly have quite nice care if it had come from a poor home. And I have seen children, I've seen the whole spectrum of what happens when children go into care through the various cases and families that I've been involved in the last 2 or 3 years since I've been doing this sort of voluntary, what you might call voluntary protection work, but it's not really protection because I don't have the authority, but it's sort of intervening in cases where there's a child protection issue and trying to make sure that there's fair play, or to help support the family usually and the child in the situation.
So could you give some
And I can give an example where some children who had been taken from allegedly dysfunctional parents told a court, and it was a criminal trial because the parents were being accused of crime in this case, that they were having a lovely time in care. They were given lovely food, they were given lots of toys, new clothes. They showed that, this came through video link into the court. It's a criminal, as I say, criminal court is a different court to a family court. These children were very gung-ho and very cheerful and upbeat about their circumstances in the care home where they were, the foster care home. And therefore, you can say that superficially children may feel better or may feel that they're having a better life. But you don't know what's happened to them emotionally, and you certainly cannot be quite so sanguine in thinking that all children taken into care, their circumstances are improving, or that it's something that emotionally is in the child's best interests, either in the short term or in the long term. And then there's the added thing that happens in care, which is really becoming to the nitty-gritty here, is that a proportion of children will suffer abuse. And this is the whole... I'm rather cynical by now, because I see the numbers of children being taken into care rising every year, not just by accident, but by design, and almost as though there's some governmental agenda to increase the numbers taken into care willy-nilly, regardless of whether on the ground the numbers of dysfunctional families are sort of multiplying incrementally at a certain rate. The politicians of our day are saying more and more children need to be taken into care and need to be adopted faster. That, if you ask David Cameron, he would confirm that. This is the agenda. We have to say, why is there a need for more and more children to be taken into care? Why is fostering and adoption such a multi-billion-pound business as it is? And then you might immediately come back to the notion that possibly there's a lot of money in it.
Yes. Are there some examples to illustrate that?
I can tell you. I can just give you.
If you get 10 children or 5 children or whatever, is there a lot
First
of
of all,
money?
the foster carers get quite a lot of money. They get something between £400 and £500 a week for an average child. If it's an older child, a disabled child, or a problem child, they might get a bit more. But let's say an average of somewhere between £400 and £500 a week for fostering a child, which is quite a nice wage packet, isn't it, for somebody? And they can keep the child, possibly on quite low outgoings for that money, and pocket the difference for their own enjoyment or whatever.
So do you think this is just a...
and then also the agencies that set up the foster care families, they really are that's where the big money turns over. I think it's like something like £1,200 or £1,500 per child to be placed with the foster care.
So there's a financial incentive for these agencies
Yes.
to make money out of the care system.
There's also other elements of the process of taking children into care. Going back to the family court, there are these experts who give witness evidence, and again, I have to say, against the parents from whom the children are being taken in the family court, who are paid something like anything up to £20,000 for maybe a 10 or 15 page report on the parent. And it's not in that many cases, but at least in a significant number of cases that I've come into contact with, they haven't even interviewed the parent.
They haven't even interviewed the parent?
No. Why is it a bad thing that children are taken into care?
Yes.
I didn't say it was a bad thing in all cases, and then interventions may be necessary in some cases, but I would say, if possible, in the vast majority of cases, children should be kept with their birth families, because they tend to, within the birth families, you have a whole range of people with an interest in the child's well-being, not just mum and dad, but grans and nans and aunties and uncles and siblings, cousins. And
essentially the family unit
is
being attacked.
It seems as though it's being attacked at times with one's most cynical hat on. Yes, it does seem as though the family's under attack. And people at a certain level of society's family life is being attacked, because they tend to be the people who are least able to defend themselves in the family court. People from maybe the lower income brackets who have not had the education that other people and haven't got the financial resources to defend themselves. Families do get legal aid, but that's being cut back, and therefore that's making life very difficult for
I mean, you've been involved with the Holy Cleig campaign.
Holy Greg campaign. That's a different side of the coin, if you like. It's a different issue, because that's about child abuse, a case of child abuse. I'm talking about the process of taking children from their birth families.
Right.
And I'm glad you've actually highlighted that a connection needs to be made between that aspect of child abuse and what I feel is equally, at times, child abuse, which is taking children from their loving parents, unnecessarily and unjustly and in a very brutal way at times. That's another side of it. How do the two connect? The two connect because of the governmental agenda that more and more children need, according to our leaders, to be taken into care. Why do they need to be taken into care? Because it's better for them, because there's so many, dysfunctional families and all the things that are told to the public about it. This is really helping the children. It's child protection at its finest and all the rest of it. Children are better off sometimes with a good adoptive family than with a poorly performing parentally birth family. They're going to go up in the world if they go to a foster family or an adopted.
Are these children actually going to better places, or are they facing a much darker future?
Well, this is what I'm saying. In a proportion of the cases of children taken into care, they are facing paedophile abuse, basically. And therefore, now I'm really cutting to the chase. The system of taking children into public care, into state care, facilitates their abuse by paedophiles. Because obviously if they're away from their birth families, nobody's looking out for them, and the adults responsible for their care are not listening to them, and they can't go to the police, and if people are telling them not to say those nasty things about whoever it is that's coming in, some local official, could be even a clergyman or whoever it is that's coming in, they are at a huge disadvantage over children who have still got all their grannies and uncles and aunts and other siblings and their whole community around them.
There's a scale of abuse also on the parents. I mean, there's somebody that I'm only one case that I knew of where the individual parent was literally thrown out of her own house within about an hour with nothing. And how does somebody function in those conditions? It seems like there's a wide open license for wholesale human abuse on virtually every level here.
Well, what I particularly object to is the heavy-handed use of the police in these operations of removing children. This is really where it becomes very dark and very, sort of feels like some sort of totalitarian state or something. So heavy, what the police are like these days. They're armed to the back teeth, aren't they, and bristling with all sorts of gadget and weaponry. And they come in, and their very presence in a family, a small flat where a couple of children are, this is their home, their sanctum, the nest where they've been living. That these dark, sinister, threatening figures coming in with their heavy boots and their gruff voices surrounding their mum. I brought along to show you. I think this describes as well as anything that I could actually say what a typical child snatch looks like, in the raw. I mean, obviously the figures, the numbers of people involved, either in the family and how many children. But here you have a really dark scene of these people with police uniform on, the mother holding the baby to her breast.
Now, what's the background of these pictures? Are these available online?
This is a Russian artist who feels that it's her mission to expose through her art to the world the darker side of the child snatching scene, and the really almost the processing that she sees at the darkest, that children are almost being processed. They're taken from the natural environment into an artificial environment where they are sort of processed at all levels. Processed, the perception of reality is processed, their emotions are processed, their diet and all the things that they eat would be processed from then on. I mean, they would go to school and share the same experience as other children still in the normal, natural environments. But
do they still have friends with their other children, or what?
I don't know what actually. It's one area where I'm not so familiar with what actually happens in the school between children who are in care, attending school, and children who are still at home with mum and dad. Obviously, I have heard things like on Mothering Day or Father's Day, there's a bit of an awkward situation because most of the children are busy making mother's cards or father's cards, and then a child, with a foster carer, well, I suppose he or she makes cards for the foster parent, but on the other hand, they may be conscious that they've lost their mother and father, and maybe other children are.
I mean, is this a permanent cessation of any contact with the parents for the rest of their lives?
In the worst cases, it is, and this issue of contact is a very thorny issue because, of course, that can be used as a tool of punishment by the local authority to parents who become too outspoken and too combative, if you like, about the fact that their children are being taken away. If they go to the local newspapers, if they make a noise on the street, or if they, basically won't stay quiet, the contact ceases.
What's the legal situation? Are they not allowed to say anything? They're not allowed to mention anything? There
are certain situations where the judge formally gags them. A gagging order is given. But up till that point, they are told that it's not appropriate for them to speak to anybody else about their situation, and indeed the whole ethos of the family court is secrecy and is not.
These are secret courts. I mean,
secret courts,
secret
not
like.
They have been recently made more open by the order of the president of the family division, who has given judges the option and parents the option to have their hearings open to the public. And in fact, I was at the first public hearing of such a newly opened family court.
Is this because these secret courts have got such a bad reputation now?
Well, many people say that where there is secrecy, there is wrongdoing, and there's, jiggery-pokery going on. And I have to agree that, dishonesty and lies and deceit and malfeasance of all kinds flourishes in secret places, doesn't it?
Now, you've got some other images there. Could you want to show those as well?
Yeah, this is the most graphic one of the child stealing.
Yes.
Situation, so as it's called.
Now, who is the artist?
The artist is called Albina Kumirova, and I became aware of her because we had an anti-child abuse conference in July, and she exhibited the pictures at an exhibition in an adjacent room to the conference room, and obviously, there are very few artists who actually go as far. I think the fact that she's Russian is quite interesting because, obviously they've had a totalitarian regime, so she knows what regimes, to use a sort of common word, she knows what regimes have a tendency towards. It's towards, here we have a mass production of babies. So here we see a conveyor belt with babies being sort of produced by faceless beings who obviously have no human, that we would recognise, interest in the individual babies, and they're on this sort of production line being processed.
This comes out of some other sort of dreams or abductions that other people in another subject see a sort of a production line of babies.
Well, we haven't quite got as drastic a scenario, we've got nowhere near as drastic a scenario as this, but we can see that there is a tendency developing towards regarding children as almost a sort of as a sort of utilitarian resource, as the future people who are going to be on the factory floor or the office floor, or who are going to be good system people and sort of deliver whatever the
you were
governmental
property
agenda
of the
is.
state when you were born. Your birth certificate, all this.
Yes, that's right. You're registered, and
you've also had some connection with the freemen of the land group.
Yes, that's another thing. The whole process of raising children from birth through to maturity is a process of perhaps steering them in a particular direction, and even their thinking.
I mean, there's now software that Microsoft has developed that the Wellcome Trust is talking about using in education, which will literally steer the mind in a particular way. Can you show some more there? That just while you.
Well, of course, this is the natural child under terrible abuse from, again, these faceless beings that seem to have no heart and no really interest in their pain. These children
and
suffering
the witch there.
Terrible pain, and there's a witch being sort of semi-crucified, semi-burned. And why is she being dealt with like that? Maybe because she's too much of a luminary. She understands too much, and maybe she's been protesting, or she's been or she's just being her natural self, or reacting in a natural way to situations which are unnatural and threatening. I don't know, because this is all you have to spend time looking at pictures like this, and then obviously.
On the phone, you'd mentioned that there seemed to be a systematic process of abuse going on of a horrendous nature.
Going back to the statistics of the thing, if you get something like, as is now, I think the number of children taken to care is something like 10,000, 12,000 probably a year, new cases of children being taken into care. Of the 12,000 a year in 2014, a proportion of them, and I wouldn't like to hazard a guess as to what the actual proportion will be, but a significant number of those children will suffer at some point of their experience of being in care sexual abuse from the people supposed to be caring for them, or people being allowed to come in and abuse them by the people supposed to be caring for them. And it gets particularly bad at the older end of the spectrum. Well, I think it's terrible at any end of the spectrum, but when they get into care homes, say they haven't been fostered, they haven't been adopted, or they've been long-term foster care children, they may maybe end up in a care home such as this one. I don't know if you can see this, but this is Beechwood in Nottingham.
Yeah, if you sit back of the light.
Right, this is Beechwood home, children's home in Nottingham, which is the subject of public focus at the moment because it's where a young woman called Melanie Shaw grew up. So at the age of, I don't know, 9 or 10 when she first went there, or maybe even younger. I haven't actually got the
Now this is in the website by the UK Column.
This is the UK Column has been taking up this case of Melanie because she's now in prison. And this has very strong resonance with the other case that I've been campaigning about, which is the Holly Gregg case, where the chief public campaigner for that case, Robert Green, has been hounded by the court and has suffered his second imprisonment this year.
Now, what are the reasons for his imprisonment then? What's happened?
Well, the reasons for his imprisonment were that he continued to try to bring the case to public knowledge and awareness, and the people that he was actually originally accused of having been involved in the paedophile abuse of Holly Gregg and other children that she'd named, who were never investigated. However, they managed to get the courts and the police and the courts to prosecute in his case. They took measures to shut him up, basically, and so he was charged with breach of the peace in 2010. The case came before the court in 2012, and he suffered his first sentence and imprisonment in Aberdeen in the same year, from March to May.
Now, is this because he essentially was then done on
February
essentially contempt of court issues? In other words, he didn't know when to shut up.
It was breach of the peace, that was the charge, and that was what he was charged with.
So they found
that he had been publicly speaking about the paedophile activity of a certain group of people in Aberdeen, and certain of those people, who included a sheriff in fact, didn't like what he was saying about them publicly, and using their powers and connections. And one of them was a senior police officer, so he was able to, or because of him, we believe that there was no investigation to shut down the investigation that should have happened when Holly first gave evidence.
But it seems that in this case that there seems to be revealing that there is a specifically designed abuse going on.
Well, we're sort of tiptoeing round the issue, and I think I'm going to, at this point, call a spade a spade.
Yeah.
There are certain people in our society, at any time probably, they've always been, and they probably always will until we decide that we're not going to allow them to flourish, who seem to need to have sexual activity with very young children. And here I would actually distinguish between the sort of and it's called paedophilia or child sexual abuse.
Well, that's two things. There's child sexual abuse, but there's this ritual abuse, which is a different thing.
That's an extrapolation of child sexual abuse and paedophilia, because the point is that if you are of a certain mindset that you are able to go down on a very young child when you're an adult, in whatever way you do that, then you have to be in some degree, in fact, I would say totally insensitive, because how could you do that and cause such horrendous pain to a small human being? Or
the fact that it may not be a human being doing it.
Well, I would say it's difficult to say what sort of genetic genetic makeup they are, but they've certainly got a different mindset to other people. I actually talk about a mindset rather than anything genetic, because I think we can't really say anything about the genetics, because genetics really are too mixed up.
Well, the bodies are still bodies, but what's in
they
there?
They look human. They seem to sort of have the same reactions and facial expressions to everybody else in most situations, but suddenly become monsters in their private life. So in fact, quite a few of them, like Jimmy Savile, he's the classic archetype, isn't he, that everybody knows about him now, were very charismatic. So when they went around doing their entertaining and, you know, playing games with children in the public and presenting shows for charity on the BBC and so on, he was very, everybody laughed at him and enjoyed him. Well, I actually didn't like him very much ever, I must say, but on the other hand, you know, people would watch him, wouldn't they? And he was a sort of popular presenter, well-known public figure. And yet, obviously from the witness evidence, he became a complete monster in a private situation where just within, you know, whatever space he was in at the time, maybe his field caravan or whatever, you know, camper van or whatever, or some back room of a studio or room in a hospital or special part of the prison or whatever it was, because he was into all sorts of public buildings, wasn't he?
Yes.
He became a complete monster in respect of some poor child who'd come in feeling very excited that she'd met the great Jimmy Savile and then suddenly found herself being raped. In fact, there's a case in this newspaper that I've been looking at you, because there's this that one of the latest people pulled up for public scrutinies before the Crown Court in Manchester, and he's what's his name, Jimmy Savile's co-presenter, I think, at a certain point in time.
But the key to this case, really, about Jimmy Savile is...
Ray Terrett. Ray Terrett.
I mean, the key to this is that this is somebody who's been positively vetted to meet royalty, to meet prime ministers, and positively vetted for a very, very long period of time, almost 50 years, since the 1960s, and fronted the BBC's...
Well, if we knew enough about how this has come about and how such an institution, which has the affectionate nomenclature of auntie in the public mind, could allow such monstrosities to go on in its name and within its precincts.
And when people blew the whistle on that.
And where people, and I've got a friend who worked for 20 years in the BBC, and obviously overlapping with Jimmy Savile's activity there, who said that we all knew, you know, if you go into the canteen and sort of say that he's up to no good, or we hear that he's doing this or he's done that, everybody knew. It was a sort of open secret that he was up to no good, and yet everybody was told there's nothing you can do, because, you know, the level of people controlling this is beyond anybody's ability to influence.
This has an immense implication,
which makes you then feel that you really want a root and branch scrutiny of the whole leadership of the corporation. You know, going right back, and including now, what sort of people are employed at the BBC in high positions of authority over, you know, perhaps more lower ranking. So
where do you think this logically takes us with our society?
Well, this logically takes us because child abuse, paedophilia is as old as the hills. It's always gone on, and some people say, well, you can't stop it, so don't try, sort of thing, which I don't actually accept. I think that, you know, it's time that we did, as a aspiring civilised society, at least, you know, my idea of what we should be doing going forward into the future is becoming more civilised, not allowing criminality and primitive behaviour and psychopathic behaviour like this to flourish in the society, and people to get away with this year after year with impunity.
That type of
right. The whole focus of my campaign is that, okay, it's been going on for millennia, since God was a baby and all of that, but at a certain point in time a civilization should start to say, we're now aware of this, because mostly it's hidden. It wasn't hidden in the ancient time. Public sacrifices were very public. The children be led up some stone monument, some sort of pyramid usually, up the steps to the top where a priest would be waiting with an altar, and who knows what went on at the top in the Holy of Holies at the top before they were ritually slaughtered, you know. And so public sacrifice was regular in the ancient time. Yes, I'm just saying why people have always been in some way, at some level, inured or conditioned to accepting that child sacrifice in its varying forms, both ancient and modern, is part of normal life. So why are we suddenly not accepting child sacrifice in its current form, in the form that we are now becoming much more aware of, where children are being basically raped by senior people in positions
there's an important process that happens here.
Yeah.
It's about wrecking the psyche of the child. There's a reason for that in terms of control.
When a small child is raped, this sets off some kind of reaction in the brain. The trauma happening in the lower part of its body travels up the spine through the nervous system to some part of its brain, and either opens up or closes down certain faculties and creates a huge trauma, which then causes the brain to go into sort of seizure mode and create a division within itself between the experiences it's being experienced and then having to go on and live sort of normally after the experience. So a sort of seal or barrier is brought up in the brain to seal off that unpleasant, that acutely traumatic experience.
Which can lead to alternate personalities and control mechanisms.
So you get basically the possibility that a person who's suffered that trauma then develops what's called a split personality, and these are just sort of common terms in common parlance. But something else may be happening behind the barrier where the trauma resides. Could behind that barrier, which is sort of what you might call unsupervised territory within the brain, could be planted, however that happens, concepts, or shall we say trigger words, or trigger commands, or whatever.
Well, I mean, we're now in MK Ultra and Project Monarch territory.
Yes, and I don't have the vocabulary to describe it, and I'm not in depth student of it.
I think cutting to the chase is, it would seem that the logic of the situation is that most species doesn't normally go into such a vast amount of abuse of its own young.
No, it's unheard of in the animal world.
So well, I think there are some cases where the animal, a mother, or for some reason or other, they will eat their babies. They will eat,
yes. Even cats do that, but the kittens are in danger of not being looked after properly, so the mother will eat the kittens rather than. And in fact, even in the human level, we've had mothers who've actually killed their children rather than having them taken by social services. We do know of instances of that. But the scenario that I think you wanted me to speak about, which I want very much to speak about, is the case of Melanie Shaw, who was brought up in this care home, Beechwood care home in Nottingham. And Melanie is a whistleblower and witness to not ritual abuse, but what we might call systematic abuse of young children coming into that care home. And she said within a few days, within a week usually of their arrival, they would be raped by people coming in at night, usually at night, for the specific purpose of breaking them in some way. So a child of 6, 7, 8 arriving, a boy or a girl, would suffer this rape and would have this horrific traumatic experience, but extremely excruciatingly physically painful, but also traumatic emotionally and psychologically. And with this particular effect that you referred to, of sending some extraordinarily potent, powerful charge up the spinal column to the brain to cause a realignment of faculties within the brain, which then could be utilised down the line for programming and controlling that child.
So the logic to this seems to be that they are creating a series of children, lots of them, which will then grow up as adults where they will be able to control.
That's it, yes.
And these aren't humans who are seeking this control.
Well, when we say humans, we have to understand where, you see, now we get into the human origins side of things, because for me, with my particular hat on, take on reality, I don't believe humans are a completely natural to this planet indigenous species. We are hybrid species. And the Bible says this, it's not just me sort of having some strange theory about how human beings came about.
Belinda, we're beginning to start quoting scripture here. We're getting
yes, well, if you look at Genesis 6, it talks about those who from the sky came down and sojourned on the earth, or whatever they did in biblical terms, and developed their civilization, and then felt a bit lonely and looked at the daughters of men and saw that they were fair, basically had their way of them. And we are the product of that union of the beings from the sky, whatever beings they were, whatever type of creature, but much like us, I would say.
Well, there's some arguments that that's where the Jews come from. The Jews are of that union, and that's where they feel more superior to other beings.
Well, there's a whole lot of manipulation of the mythology here, so we can't really say any particular race, because I happen to have connections with the Oriental races.
Yes.
And they have a creation myth and, unique creation.
What are can you explain the difference, these different creation myths, briefly?
Well, basically, certain societies, certain cultures have a very strong creation myth. The very strong re-imprint in the minds of each successive generation that they come from some divine source.
Yes.
Right? And the divine source is the thing, that they're not just they haven't just grown up on the planet, but there's something divine that's superior to the run-of-the-mill creatures of the planet has come in and created this particular race or this particular people or culture. Right? So the Japanese have that very strongly. The Jewish people at a certain point in history seem to have taken up that notion. And I say a certain point in history because I think there's a historical component to how the Jewish people have come about.
And the African, and then of course the Indian races have similar.
Yes,
they have similar stories.
Yes, but some cultures have an even more strong than others idea of being created by a divinity as some kind of chosen race.
So it really shouldn't be too much of a shock to people if we did have a disclosure. Steve Bassett and so forth. Have we had a disclosure?
Steve is currently touring Europe and will be with me in a few days. So
I mean, it shouldn't be too much of a leap to have a disclosure where the elite are ETs. As opposed, or different ETs,
well, I would say
we're all ETs.
We're all ETs.
Yeah.
It's to what extent our genetics is ET at this stage, and to what extent, just part of the indigenous higher primate physiology, if you like, or species variety of the planet. We have an animal side.
You've got a gentleman who's taking action on this beside you, who's been sitting very patiently during the interview. Could you explain, you're going about walking and campaigning to highlight this issue that Belinda's talking about?
Yeah, well, I'm walking against all forms of child abuse, cover-ups, forced adoptions, and for a safe home for children, because so many children are being taken in forced adoption from secret courts now, and having met many of the parents of these children, there seems to be many lies and false allegations made against them. A case this last week, one mother was continually told in court that she had learning difficulties, and since then I've seen her sort through legal papers to have another mother who's having his children taken away. So there's no learning difficulties with that lady as far as I'm concerned. And what I'm doing now is trying to walk from one end of the country via all the parliaments. I've been walked from Edinburgh to Belfast, Dublin and Cardiff parliaments, and now I'm on my way to Downing Street, asking for sensible human rights laws to protect all the children and families that have been abused and children have been stolen. And there's so many cases of child abuse, such as this Melanie Shaw, and we're meeting all the youngsters on the streets who've been abused in care. and they're wanting to fight back for it, and I'm hoping to get up another walk next year with these children from John O'Groats to the London Marathon. The newspapers don't seem to want to print these stories of what's happening in family courts, so the idea is to take it out to as many people, to different towns and cities as it's possible to do so, and eventually maybe we can do something that the papers will decide they want to print.
How do you get the papers to print these things? Because the media does seem to be completely shut down on all this issue.
Well, yeah, we've tried quite a lot of things, and a 73-year-old man to be walking the length and breadth of the country, sleeping out the same as children who run away from home with no proper sleeping bags or places to sleep. I'm trying to make it realistic, and I've walked through the Brecon Beacons, through Wales, through Scotland, and newspapers don't seem to want to print it. If you talk to them, they just shy away. I think I'm afraid of legal actions against them. So it's going to be difficult to get publicity through the newspapers, but we'll continue.
So how do members of the public find out about this walk for justice, and how do they contribute, or what can they do?
Our Walk for Justice is a Facebook page, but I'm also walking for Children Screaming to be Heard, which is a website where they're trying to get a safe house for children, because there's no safe house in Britain for children under the age of 16.
These are for children who run away from care, isn't it?
Yes.
And
now this is a very...
They have been filmed and interviewed on railway stations at the very dead of night, having run away from their foster home or their care home, having been raped, sometimes arriving at Waterloo or Charing Cross in their pyjamas, blooded pyjamas, and being looked after momentarily by the homeless community, and then the police come and round the poor children back up, take them back to wherever it is they've run away from. So they return to their abusive situation. What doesn't happen is that their abusers are investigated, so there's a systematic police-enforced veto against listening to children, the ones that are really giving witness about the worst atrocities and crimes against them. And it is crimes. Why are crimes against children never investigated, or rarely investigated? If an adult was raped or done to, like some of the children forced to suffer, you'd never hear the end of it, would you? And yet the things that are done
we aren't hearing the end of it, because these crimes have just happened.
No, I'm saying
30 years or 40 years ago are being dragged up to nail people today.
Yes, but on the children front you don't hear even the beginnings of the stories of the crimes, because important people are involved. We know from...
Untouchables, we're told.
Yeah.
Untouchables. And so how do you break this? The enforced official silence and even brutality towards the witnesses and whistleblowers, like towards poor Melanie in HMP Peterborough. Melanie Shaw, the whistleblower we've been talking about, who has given witness to lots of systematic abuse going on in the care home she grew up in, and also in other care homes of the same area. So
is there anywhere where people can find out more information about this?
The best thing is to go onto the UK column, and because they've been covering the story of Melanie's fight in the court, or lack of fight in the court, because she's not produced from the prison to the court when she should be for the hearings, and also the public movement that's growing around to have her freed and released, because she's been now 86 days on remand as we record this, which is almost coming up to Robert Green's 96 days on remand for whistleblowing on the Holly Gregg non-investigation in Scotland earlier this year. So that we're getting the whistleblowers and the witnesses locked up and treated very badly, in Melanie's case really brutally treated.
Well, we're getting cases, I understand, in Australia now that the whistleblowers will be locked up and pursued. New legislation has been brought out there to stop whistleblowing.
Yes, and so it will get to the point where more and more of the public will know about it, and then they have to take a moral choice as to whether they stay quiet. Basically, we are at war with our own genetics and our own inner nature. We have to decide at a certain point in our life when, you know, we're really challenged fundamentally. We cannot back off from something. We cannot wipe it out. Where I think this has happened with the Jimmy Savile thing, and probably agonised quite a lot of people employed by the BBC, and probably high time.
Well, if ITV hadn't done a documentary, the Jimmy Savile thing could be whitewashed by the BBC even after his death.
Yes, so a lot of people are being challenged in their innermost beings as to whether they join a movement such as ours, which is going to press for the inquiries that are needed into the historic cases and into the ongoing organised cases going on now.
But with whistleblowers going to jail.
Yes, and therefore, and pressing for the whistleblowers, pressing on the local police authorities and the prison authorities and the police to release people like, and the courts to release people like Melanie and allow her to make her statements to the public, so everybody can know what she and hundreds of other children suffered in her home over the years, and in quite a few other homes around in the same area. And that's just one area. And press for Holly Gregg's abuse to be investigated up in Scotland. You know, the public, what's lacking up till now is the public engagement in this, and why, for the reasons that we talked about earlier on. People say, oh, well, it's an area that we can't touch, you can't go there.
Well, the people are untouchable.
The people are untouchable.
There are these untouchables who can commit any crime.
They're only untouchables because the public allow that to go on, and the public are sort of passive and acquiescent and somewhat apathetic.
Well, is it not because the media is basically saying everything's okay, move along now?
Well, people in the public know it isn't okay. You know, that much is, the media cannot say it's okay when it isn't, because we now have the internet. And on the internet we have enough information on all these dark subjects for many, many people, independently of what's printed in their local or national newspapers or on their TV screens, to say I'm not going to just take the official guff that's being given to me, you know, it's all okay and it's for the child's best interests, and, you know, the children are going to a better life in care, and the paedophile rings are being investigated. We've got Operation U-Tree and Operation Daybreak in Melanie's case, and we've got, you know, all these police operations all in hand, it's all being dealt with properly, when it isn't. We're going to have more and more public saying nothing is happening. We're only seeing a few elderly gentlemen hauled up before the courts.
Show trials.
Show trials, if you like. And what have they done? It's mostly they've done things to quite young children, and it's unacceptable and wrong, when really the real horrors happen much further down the age range. You know, babies, toddlers, and upwards from there, right through the small children range. Before you even, that's to me where the real problem is, and the real evil resides. And I say evil because I don't think there's anything worse in my book and in Sid's book than the evil of abusing a very young child. I don't think there's anything worse.
Finally, do you have one thing you want to say, put across, and summarise one?
My bullet point will be nobody need get locked up, nobody need get hurt, not a drop of blood need to be spilt in this battle, in this fight to get child abuse stopped. Only one thing is needed: the public to agree to face a painful truth and pass that on, so that we grow. The people who are aware become much more than a critical mass very, very soon.
Well, thank you very much, Belinda.
Yeah.
And Sid.
I'd like to see gagging laws removed, because they're not to protect the children, and they're not to protect national security. They're to protect those that abuse and cover up their crimes. And immunity must be removed. It's a violation of their victims' human rights.
Maybe more victims speak out as well if they can.
Yeah.
Well, we must create a climate where whistleblowers and victims are protected. You see, that's another thing. The protection of whistleblowers is crucial in every branch of the truth movement. We know that, don't we?
Yeah.
You know, the science, the truth about, you know, scientific reality and things that are...
GMOs, the subject is almost endless.
Yes, the pollution of the environment and the distortion of the food supply, the food that we have. The illegal wars and, you know, the false flag terrorist operations, and right across the whole spectrum we need to protect the whistleblowers and people who do have the inside knowledge from prosecution by these evil people who are perpetrating these deeds, because they're doing it because they have the power to do it. And they do it, you know, if we were asked to go and vote, well, we were asked to go and vote, Parliament was asked to go and vote as to whether to go and bomb ISIS in Iraq. And unfortunately they said they should go and bomb ISIS, yes, by, what was it, 200? Majority.
Well, they're bombing a lot of sand pits. They're bombing ideas and not bombing resources. That's why they didn't have any targets. But anyway, we've run out of time. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Okay.
And
so it's public awareness and public knowledge. That's what's needed.